Hi there, welcome to the Culture of Life podcast from Human Life International. I'm Tad Wojcik, the Mission Research Specialist, and this is, as always, Father Shenan Boquet, our president.
Good to be with you again, Tad.
Yes, absolutely, Father. Today we're talking about your article released on February 28th, 2022. This is about a recent decision in Colombia by the Colombia Constitutional Court about abortion. Can you describe us, Father, that decision? And with it, are there any restrictions left on abortion in Colombia?
Well, that's, what's interesting, Tad, is that, this is throughout the, developing world, and, Latin America being part of that conversation, we see a continual push, by internal pressure and by external pressure. And we'll talk more about that in a little while. I know that, what kind of groups are doing these types of work, that we've seen through the court system, through the legal system, a push to impose, abortion through the court systems upon people. And here's an example of one. So Colombia, from a 5-4 decision, the court now basically removes restrictions up into 24 weeks of gestation, so the development of a human child, which basically the prior law, in a sense, or the prior, position of the Colombian government through its legislation, and which was upheld by the courts, was that abortion would be permissible in issues where the health of the mother was in question, and maybe there were issues of rape or incest. In other words, it was very restricted, very small, though we're opposed to any assault on human life at any stage. But in the sense of the law, it was very restrictive and it had a limitation. What this decision, which again is not a legislative decision, it's an imposition of the court, which, we're hoping that those who are going to fight this decision, that it will be held unconstitutional, in the sense, because it goes against the Constitution of Colombia. But for the moment, this now becomes what is being pushed by the Constitutional Court, which means the restrictions are gone. So up until that period of time, 24 weeks, a woman for any reason, for any decision, can take the life of her child.
And to be clear, so that's at will abortion, essentially, on demand, right?
Exactly, on demand.
And prior, it was, I think, a 2006 decision that it had just been restricted to.
I think it was 16, but right.
Okay, cases of rape and incest, and life of the mother type. That's a triad of kind of typical.
Well, it's a typical thing, right?
Yeah,
exactly. It's what we see, Tad. So much within these systems. Basically, what they do is they find a way of getting their foot in the door, and they use the hard cases. And we've seen this in many other parts of the world. So this is an example where hard cases were used to open a door, and once that door was opened, then the next thing is to get it where it's completely removed. So you take the restrictions away. So this is what happened here. And so what's unfortunate is that, again, we're looking at, as we saw in the United States, an imposition by the court. And not through a legislative process. I mean, we would still be opposed by all means against a legislative process, but through the legislative process, as we would see here in the States, it involves a tremendous amount of conversation among people, and people have a way of participating, and it's really transparent. You speak to your representatives, you have meetings and gatherings of conversation. So there's a way where all of us can be more involved and not hidden behind the doors and not governed by a majority position of 9 people. So it's a very dangerous precedent. We're not unfamiliar with the precedent, but I think what's important, for our listeners is just to be aware of what's happening. Not just in Colombia. We can look at Ecuador. We can look at other parts of the world, in Africa, where we're seeing the same kinds of push. And so I think it's very important for us to be aware, of what's happening, not just here in the States. I mean, right now we're looking at the Dobbs case out of Mississippi, and in Jackson, and so we're hopeful that there will be, a new law and life will be protected. And so as we see the states shifting in maybe a new direction, at least from a legal point of view with regard to human life and the protection of human life, what we're seeing in the developing world and other nations is the opposite direction. So it's kind of interesting in this moment of time.
And how much of that, Father, do you think, and this thought just occurred to me, is motivated by the same actors, right? The same actors observing what's going on in the U.S. that they had, pushed for decades and are seeing, falling into retreat seeing their efforts kind of at bay now are pushing elsewhere in the world.
Right.
Do you feel that it's the same kind of maybe International Planned Parenthood Federation, IPAS,
Right.
the UNFPA, World Health Organization, et cetera?
Right. Yeah, you still have the same advocates that are pushing for abortion rights, really have a global face. And, they might have different names in different parts of the world, but typically if you peel them down, you will see the main fundamental primary players in here, which are some of the people you mentioned. And I think, for our audience, and for some that might be familiar with how the UN really plays into this. And if we just peel back, under the Trump administration, for example, we saw where funding, of these kinds of works coming from the UN, in other words, through the UN and through its very agencies like the WHO, the World Health Organization, or through the United Nations Population Fund and other mechanisms being used to really push these agendas in the developing world. And under the Trump administration, we saw those fundings being pulled. And sadly, under the Biden administration, we've seen that basically the doors open and the monies begin to flow again. And so as a result, the very agencies that are working through these non-governmental organizations are, again, just continuing to advance their cause. And then you see the other players in some of the foundations that many of our people would be familiar with, the George Soros Foundation, you get to the Kennedy Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation,
the
Ford
Gates Foundation,
the Gates Foundation. We go through a litany of them. And they all have different
Center
ways.
for Reproductive Rights also.
Exactly. And all the ways that they infiltrate into those through their funding and through their various mechanisms. This is what we see. And so this is what happened in Colombia. So it wasn't just an internal force, it was an external force, trying to advance this so-called right that they believe in. And so, and again, I think in Colombia, as we see in Ecuador and other places, the pro-lifers are very active. They're very much present in this debate, and so have been really doing great work to educate the population, to help people to understand what the issues are. But unfortunately, because we see how the pro-abortion advocates work, they work from the top down. They try to push. They try to advance through the courts, through the legislative systems, through the various education, media, and they just keep pushing.
Even the executives, like for example in the case of the U.S. with various executive orders and things coming from the executive branch.
Yeah. So this is what's happening, within this moment of time, and I think for many of the pro-lifers, who have been actively working in Colombia to prevent such a moment to happen. Obviously they have all the articles I've read, and I talked about a few of them in my column. It's not like they're going to go home and hang up their hat. This battle just continues to move forward. So it's important for people to realize, what's unfolded, what are the dynamics, and really how arbitrary. Again, I want to make sure, because I know some people may, get into this, our conversation not at the beginning, or maybe listen to halfway in, but none of us are in favor of any law or any whether it be through a legislative body, whether it be through a court system that arbitrarily decides that a life has value or doesn't have value. We advance life is precious from the moment of its beginning, the moment of conception, to its natural end. That's what we advance. So when we talk about these issues, I want to make sure we're not given some false impression that we're okay with those hard cases.
Right,
by any means. No.
It's not a Catholic position.
No, by any means. So, but what we see here in this particular case is, where did the court come up with 24 weeks? It's just an arbitrary choice of a period of time and there's no rhyme or reason to it. There's nothing behind it other than some arbitrary advancement of some period. And so, but to also see that basically, as we see in so many other countries, there's nothing to prevent the abortion from occurring. Basically, it's just, like you said, it's just open. It's it's at will. And this is obviously, and why 24 weeks? Why not all the way to the end? Which is what we're going to see.
Right, there's going to be pushing.
Well, if we go 24 weeks, why can't we go through the whole gestation period, all the way up until the time of birth? So you see why there's so many layers to this, and the problems that the court has now created. And now we have to pray for our advocates, our pro-life advocates in Colombia, to keep bringing this forward and bring it through the system. I know that's going to happen.
Right.
There's no doubt in my mind. They're not just going, and the bishops have already made their commitment in Colombia.
I was pleased to see pretty strong statements from the Colombian Bishops' Conference. That was, maybe we can give a quote here. You gave a couple in the article. It was pretty brief, but they said, sorry, I have to find where that was. Yes, one cannot hide or minimize the fact that any pregnancy involves the existence of another human being different from the mother, helpless and vulnerable, who in turn has the right to be part of the human family, etc. Direct abortion is an immoral act and a violent practice contrary to life. That's a nice, strong statement coming from the Catholic Bishops' Conference.
Exactly. And we've been very fortunate to be working with the Bishops' Conference in Colombia for many years. We have a number of our educational programs there. We've worked with many pro-life leaders there, catechists, priests, religious, lay faithful, professionals. So we've had a footprint in Colombia and still do, very actively involved. And I've been very proud of their work. And that's why, I know and I'm confident that despite this imposition by the Constitutional Court of Colombia, that the fight is going to continue, and that we just got to pray that they have the ability to touch the hearts of those in leadership to see how wrong this is. Right. And really do in a way that we've seen in many other countries where they have made the restrictions more and more. Now, instead of going to the end of just open-ended, we've seen such more laws being passed.
Or a retreat of the
limitations and limitations,
onslaught.
like we're doing here in the States. We've been gradually chipping away at these so-called rights and making abortion more limited and protecting human life, like we see in the state of Texas right now. As long as that heartbeat law remains intact, in the state of Texas, life is being saved every day, every day. And so these laws do make a difference. And what we're going to see in Colombia, this is, I think, Tad, which is so upsetting to see. And I don't know if our audience remembers when Ireland, legalized abortion,
right,
and what we saw,
time,
dancing in the streets. And it's such an appalling thing to see that we're celebrating the death of another human being, the right to kill another human being. Same thing happened in Colombia. And it's a very frightening thing to witness.
In particular because both have a tradition of being quite strong Catholic countries.
That's right. Exactly.
Latin American, Colombia, strong Catholic culture, traditionally speaking, and same with Ireland's pretty clearly.
And for me to watch it when I'm watching the videos, it's one, I feel sorry, for so many because they don't understand the full spectrum of these issues, and some have been duped, into these so-called rights and beliefs. But there are many in there that are very hardcore, very strong advocates for rights for abortion, and to see people, dancing in euphoria, just the idea that they won some great, in their mind, they won some great right. But in reality, it brings upon a nation, not only the death of its unborn, but its future. And this is what they're bringing into this nation. And they did it when they first legalized those hard cases. So it started, back in 2016. And what your realization is that now here we are, and it's just going to continue to advance.
And I think that might be an effect, that cultural kind of change in consciousness in a much darker direction, as we would say, is probably a direct consequence, again, of those top-down, non-governmental actors influencing the culture, doing a lot of what they would call education work or things like that, which basically means propaganda, etc.
And it's good for them to think, because we've talked about this, myself in our podcast. Father Marx talked about this with John Paul back in 1979. So many, long before you were born. All right. And if you think, once you allow the open door to contraception, so once that mentality enters in, all right. So basically, a rupture of the ends of marriage. The beauty of the conjugal act between husband and wife, the transmission of human life is denied, and then inevitably it leads to abortion, because when contraception fails, and it does, and it will, then they didn't want the child to begin with, it now leads to the next stage. And then what do we see from that point? We now start looking toward the other end of life, in another part of life, the bookend, I should say, the end of life, and euthanasia becomes. And so we see this in our own country, and we see it in other countries around the world, where once you see this movement of this anti-life mentality, it doesn't end. It doesn't stop, with one little aspect of of human life. It starts crossing the spectrums of life.
Right. There's a reason they call themselves progressives, right? Because there's a progression of various evils.
Right. And it does, because you think, again, because if you have a lack of respect for human life at its very beginning, why would I have respect for any other stage? And so then we begin to arbitrarily, just like the court did, 24 weeks. And again, I'm not advocating for any week by any means, but it's important just to see that we can then say, okay, why can't we, at the end of life, why don't we just pick a random age, all right? At 60, we're going to euthanize you. Why not 65? 72?
And people will accuse us of the slippery slope fallacy, but it's borne out in history. This is how it happened in the U.S. It's how it happened in the other Western countries. It's how it's happened in the same pattern happening in Ireland, these developing countries, or places just traditionally opposed, where they finally managed to convert enough people to their side.
I think the task really for the pro-life advocates and for the bishops and for others involved is we have to learn from the strategies of the other side of the aisle, and we've learned a lot over the years. Their strategies work, and so we've learned also how to employ those same strategies. We need to work within the legislative branches. We need to work within the executive branches. We need to get involved with the media and educational industry. So, and we are.
Well, that's what we're trying to do
exactly,
right here.
Exactly. So we have to use the same mechanisms and the same processes and everything we can to really engage that conversation.
And to fight on the same battleground.
Exactly. So then, John, like Pope Benedict used to say, you don't run away from the battle, you run toward the battle. And that's what we've gotten better at that. We all of us in this great cause have gotten better at this reality. So my hope is that in Colombia, that those who already are actively engaged in this have already started, by getting to the legislators and the various legal branches of government in the legal arena to start looking at this law or this imposition of the Constitutional Court and looking how can we address this? What's our next move? Right. And I've already heard from a few leaders there that this is already happening. So that's why I'm confident that we will see a challenge to this.
Right.
And now how that challenge will end, well, again, we all know that we've seen some wins and we've seen some losses. But what I think we have to do here is we have to keep encouraging those who are on the ground.
And it's probably important for our viewers to know, especially and others, anyone watching, that I alluded to this a couple times. Just as on the anti-life side, it's the same organizations that have been going for decades, funneling money around the world to kind of spread their tentacles, as it were.
Right.
We're trying to plant seeds in the same way. So what really happens in the U.S., like you talked about the Trump administration versus the Biden administration, et cetera, it's been a pattern, it's been going back and forth essentially between Republican and Democratic administrations for a while. What happens in the U.S., what happens in the Western world where there's money to go all over the developing world directly affects. So you're talking about what happens in Colombia. It's really time to think about how can we support our friends in Colombia.
Well, here in the United States, I think what's important is we need to get definitely our pro-life advocates to recognize the threat against the Hyde Amendment. We need to realize what the Biden administration is trying to do. And basically, for those that are unfamiliar with the Hyde Amendment, what it does is it prevents the use of federal monies, tax monies, to advance abortion in other countries. And so we really need to realize the threat that's in right now. And if we know, because Biden himself has said it, that he wants to remove it. And so this is a danger, because then we're again advancing onto other nations. We are literally imposing upon other nations our anti-life values. Now I don't say yours and mine, Tad,
right, but
sadly,
the nation of America
is advancing this. And with that, we already know, even under the Trump administration, as much as they were able to remove a lot of that impact, even many of those in the administration under Trump admitted that these things, as using your word, are so tentacled into so many other agencies that it would take many years to keep pulling those funds away from those agencies.
Right, I think in particular USAID is
exactly. That's another example. And so, and look, I've seen it. And those who have followed me in my writing for all these years, I've talked about this many times. You come with me, especially into the developing world, and you'll find USA signs right alongside International Planned Parenthood and right alongside Marie Stopes in certain parts, and other agencies working in the anti-life agenda. Now, that doesn't mean every aspect of U.S. aid is engaged in that arena. There are many great things that those funds do support and advance, which are very important and necessary, and we want to see that continue. But what we want to do is remove any possible advancement of anti-life mentality, abortion particularly, and contraception being imposed upon other nations. So, and we can't deny the fact of Latin America is in those scope of those same agencies, those same groups.
And I think it's particularly because of that tradition of Catholic heritage. Right?
Yeah, there's no doubt.
Yeah,
no doubt. I agree. I mean, I'm a firm believer that this is a spiritual battle,
right.
And we know that the main the enemy, the devil, who is a thief and a murderer from the beginning, has his eyes set upon the pinnacle of God's creation, which is the human being, the human person, and so he can't assault God, so he assaults the very pinnacle of that creation. It's us, and more vulnerable he can is the families and unborn and the elderly, the sick, the dying. So many, and that's where we have to really step up. We have to recognize, and I know we often talk about Mother Teresa, but she really captured so beautifully this understanding that if we can protect the most vulnerable and stand with that individual and protect that individual, then I'm going to do that throughout the lifetime. It's follow that person through and protect them. We can reverse it, that if I can say arbitrarily that this life has value or this life does not have value, then I can arbitrarily do the same thing to you, Tad, and you can do the same thing to me. There's no stopping that arbitrary approach. But if we instead value, as we as Catholics and many others who stand with us in this great cause, many even non-Christians stand with us in this great cause, then that means every life has value, and we stand with every life, and we defend every life, and this is what we're trying to do. And then we create the situation where you might have, quote, some of these hard cases, but that requires, again, as you and I have talked before, that requires me.
Right, a giving forward. Of self. It's
I got to give of myself.
It's the God beckoning.
That's right. Exactly.
A gift of solitarity.
Right.
Love.
The issue that may have resulted in the conception of this child may have been a very bad, violent situation, but that life has equal value to life as my life is. And so my task then is to be there to help, to accompany, to support.
It's as simple as two wrongs don't make a right.
Exactly. And again, every time I see something like this, Tad, it really does upset me. It gets down to my core.
Well, we can tell you've got a fire in you.
It bothers me because it doesn't. One country's way too many to legalize this stuff, but to see how that evil just continues to perpetuate itself, and you see Ecuador is another country right now that I didn't talk about in this article that I could have, because it's equally in the same issue. And so we can see the same thing now spreading through, as you mentioned, much of Latin America, which really is mostly a Catholic culture. And to see how, despite that great root and heritage, how this evil is being advanced and very, very sadly embraced, as we saw with so many. And I mean, again, not trying to I can't judge a person's inner being and soul, but I can look at the external. And I was thinking, as I did with Ireland, I remember bringing this up in an article, and I'll reference Ireland very quickly, is John Paul, in one of his first visits, I believe, to Ireland, was speaking to a much younger generation then, and he was saying to them, the future is really in your hands. Where Ireland goes is really up to you. And now transport forward to when Ireland then sadly legalizes this great crime against human life. Well, this would be the generation that came from that previous generation.
All right.
These are the children and grandchildren, or mostly the children, I would say, of that previous generation, standing there with John Paul, and they're dancing in the street, celebrating, the so-called win of being able to terminate, destroy, murder the life of another human being. Now we are here in Colombia watching the same thing. And it really does that's what bothers my spirit, is that from a Catholic church, as a priest, I always ask myself, okay, not the church in a sense of the church itself, she hasn't failed, but what has her minister failed to do? What have others failed to do?
Members of the church right now.
Right, exactly.
Right, us, me too.
Exactly. Where have we failed to catechize? How did this erroneous conscience become a reality in so many people? That, to me, that's what the question. The corruption of legal systems, the corruption and how evil is moved. We've seen it. I don't celebrate it by any means, but I think of the people that have bought into it. How did that happen? And then as a church, what is our response to that? So our response is obviously engage the authorities, the leaders, but also we need to get to the people. And that's what HLI does so much of. And I have seen, like in Hungary, a law can change. A people can change, a direction can change. And we have seen the fruit of that, a positive fruit.
I think
2012, I think it's when they changed their constitution, to support life.
To protect life.
So this can change. I mean, and again, we're on the cusp in the States.
I was going to say, I think we might be similar, yeah.
I agree. So we all can learn, and that's what, that's why this upsets me, as you just said, you can tell, but it also, I realize that, this is the moment. This is not the time to give up. It's not the time to hang the hat. It's the time to get back up and address those issues. And that's my prayer and I think that we, especially as a Catholic Church, as we enter into the season of Lent, I think this is a penance and prayer that we ought to be offering on behalf, not only just of Colombia, but all countries that are attempting to open their doors to these anti-life agendas and ideologies and to legalize them. So maybe, we can offer our penance, we can offer our prayers, our acts of sacrifice, for all the people who are fighting the good fight, and to pray with them in solidarity, and to unite our prayers to them and our sacrifices with them on their behalf. So there's a lot of good we can be doing from a distance, and at the same time, we ought to be as a people in our own country here in the United States, calling our own legislative leaders, and making sure that there is no funding coming out of the United States to support any group that is working in Colombia, Ecuador, any other country advancing these causes. Yeah. So we have a lot to do here. It's not just prayer. Prayer is important, but we have to act. We have to be very active in here, and realize what can we do, to prevent such events from happening.
Right, and so that seems like a perfect final note to end on, Father. The as we move into Lent, the balance of the active and the contemplative, you could say, was more spiritual, like charging, charge up with spiritual efforts, spiritual warfare, and then go out and fight, in the active sphere. Yeah. Especially as we move into Lent, because we can all be we should be increasing our fasting and penitential practices and everything for these causes, because that's how, we are as the body of Christ, the mystical body of Christ. Everything we do affects, and that's why I think, as you mentioned before, you're talking about our failures as a church, that includes me. I'm young, but my sins have contributed to the course of world events. That's the definite reality in Catholic teaching. As we sin, it affects all of us corporately. And then
turn it over,
the positive spiritual works.
That's right. And also, so my growth in holiness, my personal growth in holiness, has also that impact in a positive way. And so as we talk about this, it's important, not to fall into despair, not to be discouraged. We can be very disappointed, as people can obviously see that we are expressing disappointment, but we're also, expressing the fact that there's much that needs to be done. Yeah. And this is where our work continues, all of us, every one of us. And I can tell you, speaking with some of the leaders on the ground there and some of the bishops on the ground there, by no means, what the Constitutional Court has done is just going to be accepted. I mean, they have already, started engaging this. So that's a great sign, but I think it's also not just for Colombia, but it shows to the rest of the countries around, and not just in Latin America, throughout the world, that, that people just don't need to give way, to these immoral laws and immoral decisions. And that we have to fight against them. We have to stand in opposition toward them, and we have to do it respectfully, and obviously legally, in a sense, use the same processes, to legally move and lobby. And at the same time, sometimes it requires public rejection. It requires us to, in a sense, that maybe it comes to the point of being publicly disobedient. And that's going to require
We don't
courage.
have to, it's not, if it's an unjust law, you don't have to obey. A healthcare provider does not have to provide abortions just because a government says they have to.
So now we're talking about freedom of conscience.
In fact, they must refuse on a moral standpoint.
But as we know, each country, here in the States, we obviously understand what freedom of religion and freedom of the ability of speech and the ability, to exercise those freedoms, that constitutional freedoms that we have.
Mm-hmm.
But other countries don't have this, and so that's why each country is so unique in how to be able to approach these subjects. So that's what I also love about HLI's work, is it's really helping us to see how to deal with those things in different regions of the world, and that's been a great learning experience for me. And so I would say, to our listeners, and is to be more familiar with what I would say is a learning from this moment. Learn, how does the UN participate in this? What is the involvement of these organizations that we've mentioned, like the United Nations Population Fund? How does the WHO play into this conversation? Who's IMPAS, who are these groups?
IPAS, that was what...
IPAS, yeah. Mm-hmm. So who are these? Learn who they are. Just like I can, quote, Google them, go search them, you can do the same thing and realize, how they are engaged, and
then the funding comes from the Soros Foundation, the Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, Hewlett Foundation, etc.
So learn, and maybe it's a way for me. That's what I love about another aspect of our work, and is also obviously how can I prevent those funds from happening? Now, again, maybe it's a way for me not to buy a particular product. Maybe there's a way for me to boycott a particularly aspect that's maybe use its funds that are supported. An example of that would be what organizations, what companies, from the United States perspective.
Starbucks, maybe?
Yeah, maybe so. We have a boycott list that we support, and it's a wonderful way of learning which organizations and groups are advancing the anti-life agenda, and just don't support them. Don't buy their products, and find another product, and granted, someone might say, well, everything's tainted. Well, maybe, but not everything is tainted. There are pathways that people can take. And I say that because it means, again, I can't go to Colombia. I can, but most people will never get a chance to go. I've been to Colombia many times, and it said, but they can, like you just said. Maybe there's a product that maybe I didn't realize was supporting this industry. Well, let me stop supporting that. And will it make a huge impact? By itself, maybe not. But if enough people join together, it would. So those are the kind of things that we need to for ourselves personally, is to say, what am I doing personally to advance the culture of life? How am I engaged in this? And to what degree? And as you said, Ted, and I think that's a good way to kind of bring all this together is, we know it's a spiritual battle. We know that as Catholics at this time of the year, we're entering into a very special time of renewal, and it's a time of prayer. It's a wonderful time to evaluate, to be reflective. Again, it's a chance for me to ask, what am I doing? How am I advancing this cause? What can I do better? How can I be more engaged? Where can I lend my support more? These are things I need to be asking myself. And those are the things that help bring about change. It's when people just accept and they think that there's nothing that can be done, and they fall into a sense of despair or discouragement, that the devil just keeps advancing his cause. No, it's when we stand and we realize the enemy has no power unless we give him that power. And that's what's allowed this to happen, is that we've allowed these systems to do what they're doing, and it's time for us to really stand. And I'm very proud, like you said, of the bishops in Colombia. And it wasn't just words to our audience. Those were I know the bishops there, and I've worked with them, and I know what they're trying to do. They are really in the conversation. They are actively engaged and very supportive of the pro-life mission. And so that to me gives me a great hope that something like this, which is so immoral, will be overturned. And we just got to pray not only this, but let's go back to that previous law and also unravel it and prevent it from happening.
Extirpate the whole thing.
Completely. Amen. From your lips to reality.
Let's pray so. All right. Thank you very much, Father. That's wonderful, beautiful, and that's a good positive note of hope that we can end on despite this terrible news.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much for watching the Culture of Life podcast from HLI. God bless. Please subscribe to the video, like, and keep on living the culture of life. Bye-bye.